I don't know. I could not keep my job that I have now in data formation. I don't know if any Formula One driver would be interested.
Are you disqualifying yourself before you even get the chance?
The job comes first, right?
Very career-driven here at Grid Gals.
Gotta prioritize the career here. No, who am I kidding? Hi everyone, welcome back to episode 12 of Grid Gals. We have an off week this week, no race sadly, but we've been getting a lot of questions from some of you guys and some other people that we've been talking to who have recently either gotten into F1 through watching Drive to Survive or just stumbled upon it and found their way into the sport. And so we figured we'd do a beginner's guide to Formula One, give an overview of some of the things that you need to know before going into a race weekend.
I think the first place to start is probably who's in Formula One. Like, what does it look like? We talk a lot about the drivers, especially in our episodes, and we talk a lot about teams, but we haven't actually walked through which drivers are on which teams. I think we got a little bit excited, as we do. And so now we're going to walk through the different teams, which drivers are on there, first and last names, and any applicable nicknames. There are a couple drivers on the grid who do have nicknames that they are known by and will be called by the commentators. So just want to start from the top. And KP, since your boy is the reigning world champion, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, so I think the reason why I really actually like this sport anyways, there's only 10 teams, 20 drivers. It's not like NFL, NHL, baseball. You have a million different teams, a million different players.
Well, in getting into those sports, at least as someone who, I was raised in a hockey household, I'm relatively familiar with the sport of hockey, but getting involved in any sport as like a true fan or quote-unquote diehard fan can be a little intimidating. There's so many players, there's so many teams, lots of statistics that a lot of people seem to know, and as somebody who plays bar trivia, the sports category can be a little daunting.
Yeah, here's a plug. If you're like a big sports fanatic and you live in Chicago and you know a lot of sports facts, hit us up. We need to like really start doing better at trivia. And that's the missing piece.
Please join my trivia team.
Yeah, because I definitely bring down the team with that. There are times when you guys say a sports team and I can't tell you what sport we're talking about. Especially when like different seasons overlap. It's too much.
No, that's fair, and I think that's why F1 really appeals to us.
Yeah. So from the top of 2021's Constructors' Championship, we have Mercedes, and that is Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. And I don't know that this is a nickname for for Lewis Hamilton normally, but we just started calling him Hammy.
Here on Grid Gals,
yeah,
we call him Hammy. You've heard us say it.
It slips out.
You'll hear us say it.
Yeah.
We're referring to Lewis Hamilton.
Right. And then second in Constructors' Championship was Red Bull with Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, also known as Checo, which is one of my favorite nicknames on the grid.
It's fantastic. It rolls right off the tongue.
Yeah. And I honestly forget that his first name's Checo. I honestly forget that his first name's Sergio because we say Checo so often.
Yeah.
Then, Mary, you want to take over for the third in Constructors of last year?
Third last year, but looking better this year, is Ferrari, the iconic team. Current drivers are Charles Leclerc, who sometimes we call Shaw. He's from Monaco. Sometimes they get a little fancy with the pronunciation. And Carlos Sainz. And Jack, for the next one.
Yes, why thank you. So next in the prior year constructors lineup was McLaren, and the two drivers from McLaren are Daniel Ricciardo, which you'll often hear us refer to him as Danny Rick. The other driver is Lando Norris, and you'll hear us often just refer to him by his first name, Lando. And KP, I'll give it back to you. You can take us through the rest.
Do we call Daniel Ricciardo, is his last name actually pronounced Ricciardo? Like, do you pronounce both C's in that?
He's both Italian and Australian.
Mm-hmm.
I've only ever heard it pronounced as Ricardo. I haven't heard anybody get too funky with it.
Ricciardo? I've heard that before. When they're like commentators in different countries, I feel like
I was going to say, granted, usually we listen to Sky Sports, the UK broadcast, so perhaps on the Italian one it is different. Italian fans of Grid Gals, hit us up. Let us know.
It is interesting hearing the different commentators, though, because the American commentators were not referring to pronunciations in the same way at all and using different terms, so...
That's true. We got a little catching up to do here in America. So I think then the next team is Alpine with Esteban Ocon and Fernando Alonso. And I really like this pairing. Fernando Alonso is a prior Drivers' Championship winner. So how many does he have under his belt?
I believe he has 2. And for fans that have been around for a little while, Alpine is formerly known as Renault.
Mm-hmm.
So they have changed their name. Still the Renault engine, but we'll get to that later.
And then after Renault, we have AlphaTauri with Yuki Tsunoda and Pierre Gasly. After AlphaTauri, last year we had Aston Martin, which of course has Lance Stroll and Sebastian Vettel. Should have probably given it over to Mary to announce that one. But and how many drivers' championships does Vettel have under his belt?
4, and the youngest World Drivers' Champion ever. So we won't get into him and Max yet. But just so you know, he is Red Bull's youngest World Drivers' Champion. And not to confuse anyone, used to be on Red Bull. We'll cover the switch-ups in a later episode.
I think we'll have to do a full episode on Vettel just so Mary can talk the entire time.
I was going to say, that's a fun fact, if I ever heard one.
Yeah, if these 2 gals ever come down with COVID and I'm recording solo, you know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
She's like, I got it undercover. I got the taste topic picked out.
Don't worry, I got it. They're like, hey, it's actually a race weekend.
Welcome to the full episode on Vettel.
My man Seb. Carry on.
So sorry. So next we have Williams with Alex Albon and Nicholas Latifi. Rounding out the bottom here, we have the Alfa Romeo team, which is Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu. And the very bottom, our American team Haas.
Last year, but certainly not least this year.
Correct. With their current 2 drivers, Mick Schumacher and Kevin Magnussen.
I mean, when it comes to vibes, are they really the bottom place? You know?
Absolutely not. Kevin Magnussen is becoming a quick fan favorite.
Oh, and I mean, Gunther Steiner. I think that's also something to note. Maybe we can super quickly touch on. Team principals are prominently featured during race weekends since they're usually the spokesperson for the team. If you watch Drive to Survive, some of them are a little more media facing than others. And the big ones, especially last year with the title fight between Red Bull and Mercedes, we had Christian Horner from Red Bull and Toto Wolff from Mercedes. You'll see them a lot going head to head, especially getting the FIA involved. Again, not to get too deep into the principles right now, but I do think F1 is interesting in the fact that the teams collaborate in different ways that you don't typically see in other sports and have alliances or sister teams, which is kind of interesting. You know, it's not a typical dynamic between teams that you normally see in a sport.
It kind of feels to me like in hockey when you have the major leagues and the minor leagues, and usually like the Red Wings are paired with the Grand Rapids Griffins, and they can pull up players if needed onto their squad throughout the season. And it's interesting though because usually that team's competing in a completely different bracket, but in Formula One, you're still all on the same playing field competing.
Yeah, you're in the same league where, you know, in a lot of other sports, you absolutely have a farm team, you're developing talent, but they're not competing against you in the same competitions.
Right.
So I think Formula One is kind of unique in that regard.
Right, which I think is kind of confusing for first-time watchers because you don't understand why the reserve driver situation is what it is. We should probably identify these by the type of engine that each driver has in their car.
Really quick before we get into engines, you made a comment about reserve drivers. What is a reserve driver?
So reserve drivers are drivers that stand in for any of the current grid that might get sick or gets injured in a race, so they need someone to take their spot in the car. And this gets a little confusing just because some teams share reserve drivers, And then some drivers are reserve drivers even though they're on a current Formula One team. So I think most notably was when George Russell, who's driving for Williams in 2020, stood in for Lewis Hamilton when he got COVID. So that would be the Bahrain GP. That was important because Russell was originally in the Williams, which at that time was not a high-performing car. And when he actually got into the Mercedes, you could see his true talent. And it wasn't just because the Mercedes was a much better car. He was actually passing Bottas.
So if Russell was driving on Mercedes, who then took Russell's spot?
So when Russell moved up to Mercedes, Fittipaldi took the Williams spot. So he was a reserve driver for Williams, and Russell was actually a reserve driver for Mercedes, which is why I think the whole situation's a little confusing, especially for first-time watchers.
That's wild. Like, you kind of have almost in one race, one person is sick, so then all these drivers are almost playing musical chairs. It feels that way almost with how they have different reserve drivers mapped to different cars.
I think it's interesting, too, that you would have not only I think reserve drivers in general is a pretty standard concept. I think a lot of sports teams have people on the bench that they can call up if someone gets injured or sick. But I think what's unique about F1 is that you can have a reserve driver who is another current driver, but then those people, because they're losing their current driver, call up their reserve drivers who are truly on the bench, whether they're in F2 or they're former F1 drivers who, for whatever reason, didn't get a contract renewed and are without a permanent team. Like, that's such a weird dynamic.
Mm-hmm. I think that's what we saw with also Alex Albon, who was a reserve driver for Red Bull this past year and then ended up getting the Williams seat, which was kind of an unusual circumstance given the engine and the sister teams, which we should probably now dive into.
Yeah, I feel like since we've mentioned engines a couple of times, knowing too that there's two different championships at the same time. There's a driver's championship and a constructor's championship, because so much about F1 is not just how you drive the car, but how you build it.
Right. So there are currently 4 engines in the grid. We have the Honda engine, which is shared by Red Bull and their sister team, AlphaTauri. We have the Mercedes team, which shares an engine with quite a few people that are feeling a little bit of the pain this year. So we have the Mercedes, McLaren also has the Mercedes engine, Aston Martin, and the Williams. So that's 4 teams with all the same Mercedes engine. Then we have the Ferrari engine, which is just leading the grid this year with obviously Ferrari. We have Alfa Romeo as well as Haas. And then the one team driving with the Renault engine is Alpine.
Is it just the engine that qualifies them as a sister team, or is there anything else that would make them, like, is Mercedes and Williams only sister teams?
No, I think the engine is part of it, because I'm also assuming as a driver, having the same engine is probably a skill set that translates between cars. Because think about it, if you're going to call up a reserve driver, you want somebody who can drive your car. Mm-hmm. And I feel like an engine is such a big component that changes how you drive the car. Granted, there's a lot of other pieces in play, but it makes sense to have a sister team that shares your engine for that reason. But I don't think it's the only thing, because like you said, Mercedes has 4 different teams on the grid using their engine. They're not all in the same quote-unquote alliance that would allow them to share drivers when needed.
That's important to point out as well, because I've had a couple questions from friends that just started watching Formula One, that each team, just because they share the same engine, that they're sister teams, doesn't mean that they share information or anything like that. They are their own team. They race against each other. Mercedes is just going to go just as hard against McLaren as they would a Red Bull.
And it is interesting because I think we've seen it prior where the dynamics of buyer and supplier come into play. For example, Red Bull currently uses a Honda engine. Previously, they used a Renault engine. And so they were a buyer of Renault, now Alpine, and their technology. And because the Constructors' Championship and the constructing of the car is such a big part of the sport, being reliant on another team for a key piece, arguably one of the biggest pieces of your car, is a very interesting dynamic from a political standpoint on the grid.
Yeah, because if your engine's not performing, your car's not going to do well at all. So I think that's why we saw Red Bull want to develop their own engine. They saw that Renault wasn't performing for them. They wanted to switch, and now they're trying to develop their own because they think they can do it better. They don't want to rely on somebody else.
That was one of my favorite parts of Drive to Survive, was watching that decision be made and hearing some of the commentary of Christian walking us through what Red Bull was considering when contract was up, so they didn't know if they were going to re-sign with Renault. And it was very interesting to hear all of the pros and cons and all of the different things you have to think about when you're looking at a supplier for something so critical to how your car is going to perform.
It's a big risk to switch, but also, if you're not one of the main teams, if you're not Mercedes, you don't get any say into how that engine is built. So if you're McLaren, you don't get to decide how that engine is even shaped.
Yeah, you're fully reliant on them, which, again, weird dynamic. And I think one of the things that was nice about Drive to Survive, and I know there's a lot of criticisms of the show, but I think it shows how important the supporting team is. You have hundreds, sometimes thousands of people on an F1 team, and it's way more than just the drivers, you know, your engineer in the garage, and your principal, who are the main people on camera, in the media. You have people at the factories. You have so many people constructing this car, supporting this team. And like you said, to not have full say and full control over such a key piece of your car, I can understand why Red Bull took the risk. And it was definitely a risk to go with Honda because, again, these are F1 cars. Not just everyone can make an F1 car and or an engine to power an F1 car. It was a huge risk. And I think, you know, Daniel Ricciardo, as we called out, when he left Red Bull, cited that as one of his concerns. They were switching to Honda, a brand new engine maker who was entering F1, and he was concerned. Granted, we've seen how that decision played out over the past couple of years, but, you know, it's not an insignificant part of the team that easily could have tanked Red Bull and their performance.
He took a bet, and some may say he put his eggs in the wrong basket, but if he was familiar with that engine for so long, I can understand why that being a huge swaying point on, like, hey, we're still going to have the same key component of the car that you're used to, knowing that we've said on this podcast before, he tends to have a little bit more difficulty adjusting to a car. And if he was really worried on, like, hey, I don't know if I'm trusting or wanting to adjust to this brand new engine, I get that. But now looking back on it, it's easy to say, like, you made the wrong, like, you should have stayed. But at the time, I can understand why you would have possibly made that decision. Do you think, this is one thing that I actually don't know if you guys know the answer. When Red Bull switched, did AlphaTauri have to switch and not use the Renault engine, or?
I believe so. I would think that they follow suit with whatever. I think they probably all have to get together and decide. I'm sure there's a representative from AlphaTauri that also makes decisions for the team, but I think if one switches, the other has to as well.
That makes sense.
But I think that kind of sums up sister teams, shared engines, drivers involved, different teams involved. I think it's important to probably highlight the broader championship, how points work maybe.
Yeah, because I think we've said, you know, there's a driver's championship, and I think throughout most of this podcast, we've focused primarily on the driver's championship, because especially as a fan and as a spectator, that's what you're doing. You're rooting for drivers. You know, yes, you have a team, but having a constructor, maybe you're a little less concerned with the overall constructor versus the individual drivers. But there are two parallel championships happening at the same time.
Right. You have each driver scoring points each week, and no matter where they end up in the points, those points come together for the constructors. Each driver can score points individually for the drivers' championship, but then you add those points for each driver together for the constructors. And that also layers in a couple different strategy plays, especially when you have two drivers in the championship. How do you prioritize? I think we see that especially now as drivers are settling into the year, how they're scoring, and seeing each team prioritize maybe one driver above the other.
And, you know, Sometimes it's really obvious. You have teams where there's a very clear first driver and second driver, especially if you have, for example, a veteran driver and a rookie. Look at Alfa Romeo, for example, with Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu. It's very clear that Valtteri Bottas is the leader of the team. He's been in F1 for a number of years. Zhou Guanyu is a rookie. He's still learning. He's performing very well, but it's a very clear delineation where other teams, for example, Ferrari, of who I'm a big fan of, maybe it's not as clear, and the performance, especially in the beginning of the season, really determines how the team is going to strategize and how they're going to decide to make decisions in very key moments. For example, especially as upgrades come to a car, sometimes, again, things are happening very fast week over week. You may only get enough parts to prioritize one car. Or in a race, conditions are changing quickly. You may have to make a call to prioritize one car over the other. And so, one example right now, Charles Leclerc is leading the Drivers' Championship. It makes sense that Ferrari would prioritize him over Carlos Sainz. Even though they're at relatively similar points in their career, you can see the performance throughout this year. And again, things can change quickly in F1, but that looks like the way it's headed for Ferrari. Or, for example, one kind of big shakeup at Mercedes, Lewis Hamilton is a 7-time World Drivers' Champion. He is a leader in the sport. He holds a number of records throughout pretty much every aspect of the sport. However, this year has not been performing as well as his teammate, George Russell. And so, as the Mercedes car is being tweaked throughout the season, as all cars are, you could argue that Russell has shown up and has delivered more for the team, and they may choose to prioritize Russell over Hamilton, which again, we're not privy to team strategies, but you could make the argument based on performance in this season,
right,
that Russell is the driver to prioritize if, for example, you only have enough parts for one car.
I always think that's an interesting call when it comes to 1-2s. If you're going to have one driver take first place versus second, especially when you hear the drivers on the radios that are saying, I could pass my teammate, I have a better pace. That is always interesting to me. That's when you see the teams really decide who they're going to back for the championship.
And I think that's a good call because, again, it's much different with the leading teams. If you're fighting truly for the title, you actually think one of your drivers can be the world champion versus the teams further down the grid, let them race. Very different call and strategy there.
Yeah, because at that point you're just trying to collect points when you're further down the grid. I feel like your team, you're just trying to build up those points for the constructors, because that in the end, and I think that's another thing we probably need to touch on, that at the end is important because in the Constructors' Championship, where you rank is how much money you get for the next year.
Oh, it's huge. Even one extra place in the Constructors' Championship can translate to millions of dollars in funding.
That you see the prioritization play out a little bit more blatantly towards the end of the season. So right now I think there's still those decisions to be made and things are still happening enough
Absolutely.
Where you don't really recognize that until the back half of the season. I think one of the reasons probably why we focus so much on the Drivers' Championship is Mercedes has dominated the Constructors the last 8 years. And so this has been the first year where it feels that someone else may take that spot or has an opportunity to take that spot. Obviously, there were two front runners towards the end of the season and for the Drivers' Championship and everything. But now it's just feeling like so many different things are open, and I feel more cued into the Constructors' Championship because it feels like the other teams actually have a shot where Mercedes dominated for so long. And even in our predictions, we all had different drivers winning the Drivers' Championship, but we're like, Mercedes, no way. They've been on top for too long. It can't be that quick to change.
I don't think anybody saw them falling as far as they have.
Yeah.
So far.
That's what makes it fun to be a new Formula One fan, because there's so many changes that have actually taken effect and now have switched up the grid so much where it's more fun to watch than just see Mercedes dominate year after year after year.
Absolutely.
So if I'm a new F1 fan and I've, maybe tuned in a couple episodes of Drive to Survive, and I'm just starting to get into the new season. It's my first year watching. What are some things that you think I should know?
No, I think that's a really good question because F1, unlike some other sports, is a little more than just one event. Yes, the Grand Prix on Sunday is the main event, but really it's a whole weekend.
There's a lot of things you gotta know, Like, before you go into a race weekend. What do I gotta watch? What are the main things?
Absolutely. And I think you've heard us here on this podcast break down a race weekend when we're recapping races, but what's the actual structure of that? So a typical F1 weekend will be 3 days long, starting on Friday. You'll have a couple of practices on Friday. You'll have another practice typically on Saturday, followed by qualifying, which we're going to have a qualifying 101. I know we talk about it a lot in our race recaps, but if you want to understand what qualifying is and how it works, you can refer to our website, gridgals.com. But typically, qualifying is on Saturday, followed by the race on Sunday. However, it's not always the case.
I know we've talked about in some of our prior episodes about sprint races, so that's when things shake up a little bit for the race weekend. On Friday, you have one practice session followed by the qualifying for the sprint race. Then on Saturday, you have one practice session again, followed by the sprint race itself. And then the sprint race determines the positions for the race the next day, and you have the Grand Prix on Sunday. So a little bit different than a normal race weekend. And you can refer back to episode 10 for a little bit more information about sprint races, some of the drivers' opinions on them, and some of our own opinions on how much we like sprint races.
Or dislike sprint races.
There's really the full.
We do have some feedback
We have some
feedback for the FIA. We're like, hey, you need to change some things, but overall support. I think we support the sprint races overall.
Agreed.
Yeah, so outside of just what the actual structure of a race weekend looks like, if I'm a new fan, what else do I need to know so I can watch the races and be, a little bit in the know enough to follow along and feel like I know what's going on?
One of the key things is to understand the season, how long it is, what points in the season are really important, and how that plays into the 2 championships we talked about earlier.
So with the F1 season, I feel like it's important to probably start with testing, which is where we see the cars premiere for the first time. And I feel like each team has like a very extravagant, over-the-top in F1 style of unveiling of their car for each season. And then they go into testing where I think it was in Spain and Bahrain for this year. So that's when they go out. And it's difficult to tell whether the cars are performing super well in testing or not, but they run a different scheme for each car and really try to narrow down what looks good.
So when does testing start?
So spring testing will be end of February, beginning of March, which actually starts a very long season for Formula One because at least for this year, we have 23 races. Is it still 23 with Sochi?
It is 23. We're still waiting to see what happens with Sochi. They started the season with the presumption that there would be 23 races. So TBD on if it is shortened to 22 or they swap that one out.
Which I think might be the most races we've seen in a Formula One season. Not just us, but any viewer has seen in a Formula One season. But then they have a summer break, so they have 3 weeks off in August. And then by winter, they are done with their season. Because what was the last race last year?
The races go all the way through December. And so to start testing at the end of February, race with pretty much only a 3-week break in summer, and then go through like half of December, it's a really long season.
And they do have weeks off.
They do. But in terms of like a prolonged break.
Exactly. So there are weeks off, especially I think on those longer travel weeks. If you're going to Australia, to a different part of the world, pretty much anywhere from Australia, it's going to be a long time. But they have some weeks off in between. For example, this week is an off week, and then we'll have Barcelona and Monaco, so those are back-to-back before we have another week off. It's pretty tight, all the different countries they travel to up until winter, which is when they stop, and then they only ever have a couple months off.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that a couple of drivers have actually called out. It's a very demanding sport, not only physically, mentally, but the travel schedule is very demanding. They go to 5 continents, they visit 20 countries, at least for the 2022 season, and they have added races to the calendar. Again, like Catherine mentioned, it's currently at 23. There have been talks of expanding that even further, and I know some drivers have already expressed their concerns. For example, Sergio Perez has said if they keep adding races, he's going to quit because it's already such a demanding travel schedule as is.
And not even just for the drivers, but think about their families, their spouses, girlfriends, partners, having to travel for all that time. I think we've talked about this before, but being in a relationship with a Formula One driver, that's like your full-time job at that point, if you ever want to see them, because they're on the road for so long. And
Right.
plus, like, some destinations are really cool. You probably want to travel along with the team, but I don't know. I could not keep my job that I have now and date a Formula. There's certainly I don't know if any Formula One driver would be
Are you
interested.
disqualifying yourself before you even get the chance?
The job comes first, right?
Very career-driven
Got
here
it.
at Great Gals.
Got to prioritize the career here. No, who am I kidding? But
I would drop it all.
But they have to travel, and then I'm sure a bunch of their families don't come to every race, only the ones that are convenient. I mean, I think we can, out of the context of COVID and how the world's been for the past 2 years, I think that's created extra challenges for the drivers, and they talk about that a lot. But outside of that, even so, like getting to see your family, getting to get some semblance of being home, doing something outside of just doing your job, I'm sure. I can understand why adding more races to the calendar would be concerning to a driver. Like, I already have so little free time where I can actually spend it how I want.
Not even just the drivers. These teams are huge. You have so many supporting people traveling the globe with that many people. I can understand how it would weigh on a team.
Yeah, and I know that they're really tight just because they do spend so much time together and, you're away from your family for that long and friends. But even more than just people traveling, it's the people back in the factories developing these cars, because that turnaround is so quick too, from one season's car to the next, and when you start developing that new car, especially we saw with this new year, because there's so many regulation changes.
I think that's a really good point too, because we've said the season is very long, but clearly these seasons are back to back.
Right.
And so there are some teams that as soon as the season is over, it's really not, though. You just start developing the car for the next season, and sometimes you even start developing next season's car during the current season.
Mm-hmm. The work never stops.
Which, there may be a couple months out of the year that fans don't get races, but pretty much it seems like the season never stops.
I'm sure for everyone involved. The drivers are still training, the engineers. I mean, I guess I don't know what the engineers do in their off time, but I know the people back in the factories are still working year-round.
And I think that is one other aspect of this sport that is different from other sports, is not only, you don't have a car and race with it the full season. The car at the beginning of the season is going to be very different from the car at the end of the season because of how quickly changes are incorporated into the car in between races. So the car is constantly evolving throughout the season. And again, like Catherine said, there's so many people back in the factories help making that happen that really there's so much of this season that is kind of invisible to fans. And I think every now and then, like, I work in supply chain and the thought of having to constantly be developing, delivering, testing all of these new parts and be enhancing the car that much during the season, oh my God. Oh my God. I don't know what else to say.
I think that's why we kind of fell in love with the sport anyway. There's so many complexities to it, and it's an extremely unique sport. And I feel like maybe we'll have to do a different episode on it, but I feel like we always get asked, what's the difference between Formula One and any other racing sport like NASCAR or IndyCar?
So I want to do a follow-up from last week because we talked a lot about Mr. Worldwide, Pitbull, Miami himself. And we did some digging. Turns out, ladies, Mr. Worldwide is a NASCAR fan.
I see.
So makes a little bit more sense maybe why he wasn't, as visible or did not attend at all the Formula One Grand Prix in Miami. There is a lot of other racing that takes place around the world and in the U.S. I think traditionally NASCAR, IndyCar has been more popular in the U.S., so we'll have to do an episode later on that breaks down the differences between Formula One and some of these other sports.
We absolutely have to now that we know Pitbull is a NASCAR fan.
Definitely. And Jack, this investigative journalism, this is what the people want.
I work hard for you guys. I need to give you the details that you are requesting the most, and I know everyone was very concerned about why, or where in the world was Pitbull, honestly.
Yeah. And boy, did you deliver. I can now sleep at night. Thank you.
All I work for is a job well done, so glad to hear that you're satisfied.
A++.
So just to recap overall, some of the things we learned today, there are 10 Formula One teams, 20 drivers in all. We talked a little bit about sister teams, what they are, how they work in the sport, the different championships, so the Drivers' Championship and the Constructors' Championship. What is the Formula One season? What are the things that you need to know as a new F1 fan? We also did a little bit of an overview of race weekends and what to expect going into a race weekend for Formula One.
Then next week, we're going to be talking about Barcelona. Even though we were just in Spain, we just barely missed the F1 race, but we will still be recapping Barcelona next week.
Oh, and twist my arm. I'd hate to eat some tapas while watching that bad boy. But, again, we love all of our fans. Shout out to the Grid Gang. We love you. Please hit us up on our website, gridgals.com. You can send us an email at gridgals@gmail.com. Again, comments, questions, concerns, topics you want to hear us talk about. And wherever you get your podcasts from, please remember to like, subscribe, leave us a review. You can also follow all of our socials. They are linked on our website. And we love you all. Thank you very much.
And that's the checkered flag for this session. We'll see you back on the grid next week.